Welcome to the Palestine Center. We are very honored to have with us today two experts and distinguished speakers in the topic that we are going to be discussing today, which is obviously quite timely given that the recent war on Gaza and the current ceasefire and the new administration here in Washington and the appointment of a well-respected, capable Middle East envoy to deal with the situation. I'll introduce our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. Mr. Amjad Atallah is the director of the Middle East Task Force at the New America Foundation. Mr. Atallah is also a senior affiliated expert with the Public International Law and Policy Group. Prior to working at the New America Foundation, Mr. Atallah headed Strategic Assessments Initiative, a not-for-profit organization committed to providing legal and policy assistance to parties involved in negotiations in conflict and post-conflict situations. Mr. Atallah's efforts included running the international policy and advocacy efforts of the Save Darfur Coalition, advising the Kosovar constitutional process, and preparing scenario planning exercises for the Palestinians and Israelis. Prior to that, Mr. Atallah advised the Palestinian negotiating team in the peace negotiations with Israel on the issues of international borders, security, and constitutional issues. And I'll interject here that he also worked with Senator Mitchell on the Mitchell Report while he was at the Negotiation Support Unit. He was also responsible for liaising with U.S. government officials in Washington, D.C. on these issues.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Summer, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to speak at the center. And oftentimes you hear things here that you don't necessarily hear in any place else or in many other places. And that's a valuable, it's not only very valuable, it also, I think, helps to expand the envelope of conventional wisdom that exists in the city. And the Palestine Center plays a very, very important role in doing that. I actually met Summer about the same time that I met Senator Mitchell. I was actually one of the last of the group of legal advisors to be hired to assist the Palestinian negotiating team. And I was hired in 2000, November of 2000. I actually showed up at the same time that the committee that Senator Mitchell and Senator Rudman were going to head was created by President Clinton. And all the other lawyers already had a brief. Everybody already had, negotiations were ongoing. Camp David, on to Taba was never really a break in negotiations. There were ongoing talks that were taking place and a continuation of the negotiations despite the public spin that President Clinton at the time and Ehud Barak were trying to present. And so all the lawyers already had something to do. There were lawyers in charge of security and borders, lawyers in charge of refugees, lawyers in charge of each of the elements. And I showed up and they said, well, look, we just need you to help. You know, we're going to have an agreement within a month or so, so we just need your help to prop up the team that's working. And then we heard about Senator Mitchell, and nobody was taking it seriously because the official talks were still taking place, and a fact-finding committee to find out why the Intifada was taking place didn't seem to be of high order, and the Israelis were desperate to ignore it. And so I and a number of my colleagues requested, it's like, well, you know, we'll continue to back up, but let us also head the Palestinian response to the Mitchell Committee and the engagement with the Mitchell Committee. Of course, the Mitchell Committee became the major player as soon as Taba ended, and as soon as it was clear that Ariel Sharon was going to be the next Prime Minister of Israel, and it was clear that there was not going to be a two-state solution in any immediate term. Senator Mitchell's work became extraordinarily important. And in 5 months, he availed himself and did actually far more and accomplished far more than many of the envoys had done over a course of years. And he had a very, very, he had a very engaging style in doing it. I wish him the best of luck, and I hope that it would be nice to pretend that the 8 years that happened in between have not happened. But the truth of the matter is the world looks very different. The Middle East looks very different. The Arab-Israeli dispute looks very different. But the fundamentals are the same, just worse. And we can only hope that President Obama and Senator Mitchell and Secretary Clinton will be able to bridge that. I wanted to talk not explicitly about Hamas right now because Bob's going to talk a little bit more about that. What I wanted to talk about was the Israeli relationship with Palestinian leadership and the paradigm that they've used for engaging with Palestinian leadership. And it makes sense from the perspective of an Israeli government seeking to maintain control and occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It makes sense from the perspective of somebody who's trying to negotiate autonomy over Palestinian population centers, but who seeks to integrate the territory into Israel. It doesn't make sense from the perspective of a power that's seeking to transform the Middle East by having Israel accepted into the Middle East to have peace agreements with all of the Arab states. And we may find in the coming months that there is a fundamental difference in national security interests between the United States and between the government of Israel in how they perceive their interests if the Israelis insist on maintaining the same relationship and the same goals, and if the U.S. government actually has decided that it's in its interest to resolve the Arab-Israeli dispute once and for all. So there are several examples, and I'll be brief about them, but there are several examples of how Israel has related with Palestinian leadership that I think once we go through them, you'll understand exactly what's happening vis-a-vis Hamas and Fateh today. Israel has always looked for Palestinian leadership that would promote its national security interests. But the paradox has been that it's looking for Palestinian leaders that would keep the peace and keep security for Israel while it continued to colonize and settle Palestinian territory. That's a paradox. There is no such thing as a Palestinian leadership that will actually help the Israelis colonize the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. You can find Palestinian leadership that agrees to nonviolence. You can find Palestinian leadership that agrees to negotiation. You can find one that agrees to diplomatic processes. But you can't find one that agrees to Israeli colonization of the territory and autonomy for the Palestinians. And so at a certain point in time, the myth breaks down. And the collapse of that myth always leads to violence. First, in the 1970s, Israel had tried to have municipal elections in the Palestinian cities in the hopes that the municipal leaders that were chosen would be separate from the PLO because the PLO was not allowed to run, and that they would then be people that Israel could cultivate as a Palestinian leadership and develop to negotiate various forms of autonomy. Of course, that didn't work. Everyone who was elected was a supporter of the PLO. So by 1980, Israel began dismissing the mayors that were elected, and in 1982 just simply did away with the entire structure, while at the same time going after the PLO in Lebanon to actually destroy and try to destroy the PLO once and for all. Now, in the 1980s, also, Israel tried to create something called village leagues, in which it would appoint Palestinians to head Palestinian cities. So not elections this time, more appointed people. And these people would have the authority to issue permits and driver's licenses and to try to ease the lives of Palestinians within the cities. But they would also be the go-to people. If you needed something, you had to go to them. And they, in turn, would be reliant upon the Israelis. Again, Israel was hoping that they would be able to cultivate a new leadership that they could negotiate autonomy with. The aims of the leagues were, in the words of one of the district village heads that was chosen, quote, to improve relations with Israel, to prevent terrorism, to combat communism, and to work for the establishment of peace and democracy. Now that would sound really, really familiar in the modern context if you just changed the word communism with something else. Now by 1983, of course, the Palestinians refused to accept these models, and by 1983 that model collapsed as well.